In the shadowed corners of antebellum Georgia, where Spanish moss hangs like mourning veils and the air thick with secrets, lived a slave whose very existence was an abomination to those who created him. Born from the master's twisted desires and his own mother's helpless submission, Ezekiel bore the curse of his origins in every feature that mirrored his tormentor's face. For 23 years, he endured unspeakable cruelties at Thornfield Plantation, his mixed blood marking him as neither fully enslaved nor remotely free. The Whitmore family delighted in his suffering, finding sport in tormenting the living reminder of their patriarch's darkest appetites. But on one humid August night, when the cicadas screamed their endless song and lightning split the sky, Ezekiel's patience finally shattered like glass against stone. What happened next would stain the dining room walls with more than just blood. But how does a man serve justice on a platter? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning sun cast long shadows across Thornfield Plantation, its golden rays doing little to warm the hearts of those who toiled beneath its merciless gaze. The year was 1847, and the peculiar institution of slavery had reached its most refined cruelty in the cotton fields of Georgia. Here, among the endless rows of white gold that stretched toward the horizon, stood a testament to human suffering, wrapped in the genteel facade of Southern hospitality. Master Cornelius Whitmore surveyed his domain from the wraparound porch of the grand house, a crystal tumbler of bourbon already warming his palm despite the early hour. At 52, he carried himself with the arrogance of a man who had never questioned his right to own other human beings. His pale blue eyes, cold as winter frost, swept across the fields where his property labored under the oppressive heat. Those same eyes had passed their cruel gleam to his unwilling offspring. Though he would never acknowledge such a connection, the plantation house itself rose 3 stories high, its white columns supporting a facade that spoke of wealth built upon broken backs. Inside, polished hardwood floors reflected the light from crystal chandeliers, while portraits of Whitmore ancestors gazed down with painted disapproval at the sin that walked among them. The dining room, where the family gathered each evening, featured a mahogany table that could seat 16 guests, its surface polished to mirror brightness by the trembling hands of house slaves who dared not leave a single fingerprint. In the master's study, a leather-bound ledger sat open upon an oak desk, its pages filled with neat columns documenting human chattel. Each entry recorded a life reduced to monetary value. Samuel, field hand, $800. Martha, cook, $650. Children, 3, various ages, $300 each. But one entry stood apart from the others, written in different ink and clearly added later: Ezekiel, anomaly, value undetermined. The slave quarters told a different story entirely. Rows of weathered cabins stretched behind the main house, their walls thin as paper and roofs that leaked with every storm. Here, 43 souls called these hovels home, though home implied a comfort that existence had long since beaten out of them. The cabins reeked of unwashed bodies, desperation, and the lingering smell of the meager rations that barely sustained life. Old Moses occupied the cabin closest to the main house, a position that marked him as both trusted and watched. At 71, his back permanently bent from decades of cotton picking, he served as the unofficial leader among the slaves. His deep brown eyes held wisdom earned through suffering, and when he spoke, others listened with the desperate attention of those seeking hope in hopeless places. His cabin contained the only luxury on the plantation afforded to a slave. A small wooden cross, carved from oak, hung above his sleeping pallet. Sarah worked in the main house kitchen, her nimble fingers preparing elaborate meals she would never taste. At 28, she possessed a quiet beauty that had caught the attention of more than one Whitmore man, though she had learned to make herself invisible when necessary. Her knowledge of herbs and roots, passed down from her grandmother, served dual purposes. healing the sick, and when circumstances demanded, more sinister applications. In her cabin, hidden beneath loose floorboards, she kept a collection of dried plants that told stories of both life and death. Tobias, the overseer, occupied the space between master and slave, with the cruel efficiency of a man desperate to maintain his position. His weathered face bore the permanent scowl of someone who had surrendered his humanity for a meager wage and a cabin slightly larger than those he supervised. The bullwhip coiled at his side had tasted the blood of every slave on the plantation, some more than others, but it was Ezekiel who drew the cruelest attention, the one whose very existence served as a walking reminder of sins that should have remained buried. At 23, his tall frame carried the mixed heritage that marked him as belonging nowhere. His skin, lighter than the other slaves but darker than any white man's, proclaimed his shameful origins to anyone with eyes to see. His features, an unsettling blend of his African mother and European father, created a face that haunted the master's dreams and inflamed his waking rage. Each morning, Ezekiel emerged from his solitary cabin, deliberately placed apart from the others, to face another day of back-breaking labor and psychological torment. The cotton fields knew his touch, his blood mixed with the soil from countless beatings that left him bleeding but never broken. His hands, scarred and calloused, worked with mechanical precision, while his mind wandered to darker territories that would have terrified those who thought they owned him. The tarnished silver mirror in his cabin, cracked down the middle, reflected his dual nature each morning as he prepared for another day of servitude. The August evening hung heavy, with humidity when the Whitmore family gathered their distinguished guests for what they called their monthly civilization dinner. The dining room blazed with candlelight, crystal gleaming like captured stars, while the finest china displayed the evening's feast. Master Whitmore had invited Judge Harrison, Colonel Matthews, and their wives to partake in bourbon, bragging, and the casual cruelty that passed for entertainment among Georgia's elite. Ezekiel moved silently through the servants' pantry, refilling water glasses and removing empty plates with the practiced invisibility that kept him alive. Through the thin wall, every word of their conversation penetrated his consciousness like poison seeping into an open wound. The white folks spoke freely, assuming their property possessed neither ears nor intelligence enough to comprehend their meaning. "Cornelius, you've built quite an empire here," Judge Harrison declared, his voice slurred with drink. "Though I must say that yellow boy serving our wine raises certain questions about your management techniques." The laughter that followed chilled Ezekiel's blood. He pressed closer to the wall, his hands trembling as he held an empty crystal decanter against his chest like armor. Master Whitmore's voice carried the particular tone that always preceded cruelty. "Ah, yes, my little anomaly. Gentlemen, that boy represents a most interesting experiment in breeding stock." Another round of laughter echoed through the wall. His mammy was a fine specimen, strong hips, good for field work and other applications. "Cost me $800 at auction in Savannah." Ezekiel's knees buckled. He slid down the pantry wall, the decanter clutched against his chest, as the truth he had suspected but never wanted to acknowledge crashed over him like a flood. "The thing is," Whitmore continued, his words becoming more slurred, "sometimes a man gets lonely on these isolated plantations. The missus was with child at the time, bedridden for months, and well, a man has needs. That buck-toothed wench fought like a wildcat the first few times, but they all learn eventually." Colonel Matthews's wife gasped theatrically. "Cornelius, surely you're not admitting to—" "Oh, I'm admitting to nothing officially," Whitmore chuckled. "But look at the boy's features, Constance. Those aren't pure African bones. That nose, the shape of his eyes. Genetics don't lie, even when gentlemen must." The blood-stained birth certificate hidden in Whitmore's study suddenly made perfect sense. Ezekiel had found it years ago while dusting, a document that listed his mother as deceased in childbirth and his father as unknown. But now he understood the deliberate omission, the careful legal language that protected a monster while condemning an innocent child to a life of torment. The irony, Whitmore continued, warming to his subject, is that the boy carries my blood but remains my property. I can beat my own son without legal consequence. I can work him to death, sell him, breed him. The law protects my right to treat my offspring like livestock. Judge Harrison leaned forward with drunken interest. How does it feel, Cornelius? Looking into your own features twisted with Negro blood. It disgusts me, Whitmore spat. Every day I see my weakness reflected in that mongrel face. But it also amuses me. He's living proof that even the finest white blood can be polluted, degraded, turned into something less than human. Sometimes I think God made him ugly just to remind me of my sins. The guests erupted in laughter again, their voices blending into a symphony of casual evil that would haunt Ezekiel's nightmares forever. What happened to the mother? Colonel Matthews asked. Died birthing the little bastard. Probably for the best. On less mouth to feed, and it saved me the trouble of selling her downriver before my conscience got the better of me. Whitmore's voice held no remorse, only practical calculation. Though I must admit, she served her purpose well. Strong constitution took quite a bit of education before she became properly submissive. Ezekiel pressed his fist against his mouth to stifle the sob building in his throat. The woman he had never known, whose face lived only in his imagination, had been repeatedly violated by the same man who now beat him daily for existing. His mother had died bringing him into this world of suffering, and her murderer sat 20 feet away, laughing about it with friends. Through the crack in the pantry door, Ezekiel could see his father. He could no longer deny the relationship, gesturing grandly with a crystal wine glass. The same pale blue eyes that gazed back at him from mirrors now sparkled with drunken pride as Whitmore recounted his conquest like a hunting story. The boy doesn't know, of course, Whitmore concluded. I've let him believe he's just another field hand's bastard. Can you imagine the complications if he understood his true parentage? Though sometimes I wonder if he suspects. There's something in his eyes lately, something that makes me uneasy. The days following the dinner party revelation passed in a haze of newfound rage that Ezekiel struggled to contain beneath his mask of servitude. Every morning brought fresh torment as he looked upon the face of his tormentor father, seeing his own features reflected in the man who had destroyed his mother and condemned him to this existence. The knowledge festered like an infected wound, poisoning every interaction with a bitterness that threatened to spill over into violence. Master Whitmore seemed to sense the change in his property, though he attributed it to typical slave insolence, rather than the awakening of something far more dangerous. The beatings increased in frequency and severity, each one delivered with the particular cruelty of a man who took pleasure in tormenting his own blood while maintaining legal ownership over it. 3 days after the revelation, Ezekiel made his first mistake. While serving breakfast to the family, his hand trembled with barely contained fury, causing him to spill coffee across the pristine white tablecloth. The brown stains spread like blood across the fabric, and the silence that followed felt heavy with impending violence. Clumsy mongrel, Whitmore snarled, rising from his chair with the fluid motion of a predator scenting weakness. Tobias, fetch the chains. This animal needs to remember his place. The punishment that followed exceeded even Whitmore's usual cruelty. Stripped to the waist and chained to the whipping post behind the main house, Ezekiel endured 50 lashes that laid his back open to the bone. But for the first time in his life, he felt something besides pain during the beating. As each strike fell, as his blood watered the thirsty Georgia soil, a cold satisfaction settled in his chest. Every scar would be a reminder, every mark a promise that payment would eventually come due. Old Moses found him that night, hanging barely conscious from the post where Whitmore had left him, as an example to the other slaves. The old man's weathered hands worked gently to free the chains, his voice soft with the wisdom of someone who had survived 7 decades of such horrors. Child, What demon got into you today? Moses whispered as he helped Ezekiel stumble toward his cabin. I've seen many a slave lose his mind from the weight of this place, but you've been holding steady for 23 years. What changed? Ezekiel said nothing, but his silence spoke volumes to the perceptive old man. As Moses cleaned his wounds with strips torn from his own shirt, soaking them in well water that stung like liquid fire, he studied the younger man's face with growing concern. Whatever you learned, whatever truth came calling, you got to let it go, Moses murmured. Anger's a fire that burns the hand what holds it. You keep feeding this rage, it's gonna consume you whole. But Moses was wrong. The anger wasn't consuming Ezekiel, it was transforming him. As he lay on his stomach in his cabin that night, feeling his blood soak into the straw mattress, he began to plan with a clarity that surprised him. The pain in his back served as fuel for thoughts that would have horrified the gentle old man who had bandaged his wounds. Sarah visited him the next morning, bringing herbs to prevent infection and food he couldn't keep down. Her dark eyes studied his face with an expression he couldn't quite read, something between pity and recognition. Your eyes done changed, she said quietly, crushing willow bark into a paste. They got something in them that wasn't there before, something cold. When Ezekiel didn't respond, she continued working in silence, applying her healing remedies with skilled hands that had learned their craft from necessity. As she prepared to leave, she paused at the door. My grandmama used to say that some knowledge is like poison. Once it gets in your blood, it changes everything. Her voice carried a weight that suggested she spoke from experience. Question is, you gonna let it kill you, or you gonna use it? The rusted chain and shackle that had bound him to the whipping post lay forgotten in the dirt where Moses had discarded them. That evening, under cover of darkness, Ezekiel retrieved them. The iron felt cold and solid in his hands, the weight familiar from countless punishments. But as he ran his fingers along the metal, feeling where his struggles had worn the surface smooth, he realized that something fundamental had shifted. The chains no longer represented his bondage. They had become the first tools of his liberation. The weeks that followed Ezekiel's brutal whipping marked the beginning of a careful metamorphosis that went unnoticed by everyone except Sarah, whose knowing glances suggested she recognized the predator emerging from the broken slave, while his back healed, leaving a crosshatch of raised scars that would remain forever. Ezekiel's mind sharpened into something resembling a blade, cold, precise, and deadly in its focus. He began to study the plantation with the methodical attention of a general surveying a battlefield. During his daily labors, he memorized every routine, every weakness, every moment when the Whitmore family let their guard down. The grand house, which had always seemed like an impenetrable fortress of white privilege, revealed itself to be riddled with vulnerabilities that only someone with intimate access could exploit. The kitchen, where Sarah ruled over bubbling pots and sharp knives, became a place of particular interest. Under the pretense of delivering firewood and carrying water, Ezekiel observed the careful choreography of meal preparation. He watched Sarah's hands move with practiced precision as she butchered chickens, noting how the blade separated joints, how pressure applied at the right angle could part flesh from bone with surgical efficiency. "You've been watching me awful close lately," Sarah observed one morning as she prepared the family's breakfast. Her voice carried no accusation, only curiosity tinged with something that might have been approval. Ezekiel continued stacking wood beside the massive hearth, his movements deliberate and unhurried. "Learning to appreciate skill when I see it," he replied quietly. "The way you work with meat. It's almost artistic." Sarah's laugh held no humor. "Ain't nothing artistic about survival, child. But I suppose there's beauty in knowing how to take something apart, piece by piece, until it serves your purpose instead of its own." The hand-forged kitchen knife she wielded caught the firelight as she spoke, its steel reflecting flames that seemed to dance in anticipation. That evening, after the family retired and the house settled into darkness, the knife disappeared from its usual place on the wooden cutting block. Sarah never mentioned its absence, and Ezekiel never confirmed its new location beneath the loose floorboard in his cabin. October arrived with a chill that seemed to seep into Ezekiel's bones, though whether from the changing season or the ice forming around his heart remained unclear. The annual hog slaughter provided an education that would have horrified anyone who understood its true purpose. Standing in the barn beside Tobias and 3 other slaves, Ezekiel watched with fascination as the overseer demonstrated the proper way to render a living creature into consumable portions. "See here," Tobias grunted, his knife sliding along bone with practiced ease. "You got to respect the anatomy if you want clean cuts. Force it and you waste meat, but understand where the joints connect, where the muscle groups separate." His blade moved with surprising grace for such a crude man. "Well, then you can take apart something 3 times your size without breaking a sweat." Ezekiel absorbed every detail, the way Tobias positioned the carcass for maximum efficiency, how he used gravity and leverage instead of brute strength, the methodical progression from whole to parts that transformed a recognizable creature into anonymous cuts of meat. The lesson would prove invaluable, though not for the purposes Tobias intended. As autumn deepened, old Moses's health began to fail. The wise old man, who had served as Ezekiel's moral compass, started spending more time in his cabin. His breathing labored and his movements increasingly fragile. On a particularly cold November morning, Ezekiel found him sitting on his doorstep, staring at the sunrise with the expression of someone taking inventory of borrowed time. "I've been thinking about legacy," Moses said without preamble, his voice barely above a whisper. "What a man leaves behind when the Lord calls him home. Some folks leave children, some leave good works. Some leave nothing but pain and regret." He turned to look at Ezekiel with eyes that had seen too much suffering, but somehow retained their kindness. "What you planning to leave behind, son?" The question hung in the cold air between them like a challenge. Ezekiel met the old man's gaze steadily, his own eyes reflecting a transformation that Moses could no longer ignore. "Justice," Ezekiel replied simply. "I plan to leave behind justice." 3 days later, old Moses died quietly in his sleep, taking with him the last voice of conscience that might have turned Ezekiel from his chosen path. At the funeral, a simple affair where 42 remaining slaves gathered to mourn their lost leader, Ezekiel stood apart from the others, his face a mask of respectful grief that concealed the relief he felt at being, finally, completely alone with his purpose that night. He retrieved the stolen knife from its hiding place and began the delicate work of sharpening it to razor. Perfection! The December cold had settled over Thornfield Plantation like a shroud when Sarah approached Ezekiel with an offer that would forever alter the trajectory of his carefully laid plans. He was splitting firewood behind the main house, his breath creating clouds in the frigid air, when she appeared beside the woodpile as silently as a spectre. "We need to talk," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Someplace where the walls don't have ears and the shadows don't carry tales." That evening, long after the plantation had settled into darkness, Ezekiel met Sarah at the old tobacco barn that had fallen into disuse years earlier. Moonlight filtered through gaps in the weathered boards, casting strange patterns across her face as she waited for him in the dusty interior that smelled of dried leaves and forgotten harvests. "I know what you're planning," she began without preamble, her dark eyes fixed on his with unsettling intensity. "Don't bother denying it. I seen the change in you, watched you studying this place like a man mapping out a battlefield. Question is, you planning to do this thing alone, or you smart enough to accept help when it's offered?" Ezekiel's hand instinctively moved toward the concealed knife at his waist, but Sarah's laugh stopped him cold. "Child, if I meant you harm, you'd already be dead." She reached into the folds of her worn dress and withdrew something that made the moonlight seem to recoil. "You think you the only one with cause for revenge in this godforsaken place?" The object in her palm appeared to be a simple charm made from braided hair, but Ezekiel could sense something malevolent radiating from it like heat from a forge. The hair itself seemed to move in the still air, writhing with a life that defied natural explanation. "My grandmother taught me the old ways before she died," Sarah continued, cradling the charm with reverence that bordered on worship. "The ways that came with us from Africa, mixed with knowledge learned from the Cherokee before they got driven west. Some folks call it voodoo, others call it witchcraft. I just call it evening the odds." She held the charm closer to the moonlight, and Ezekiel could see that the braided strands contained multiple colors of hair: black, brown, grey, and disturbingly, several strands of pale blonde that could only have come from the Whitmore family. "This here contains power drawn from everyone who ever suffered in this place," Sarah whispered. "Every tear shed, every scream silenced, every drop of blood spilled on this cursed ground. I've been collecting it for 7 years, waiting for the right moment, the right person to channel it through." The implications of her words struck Ezekiel like a physical blow. "You've been planning this longer than I have." "Planning is a gentle word for it," Sarah replied, her smile revealing teeth that seemed too sharp in the moonlight. "I've been preparing for war since the day I watched Master Whitmore beat my brother to death for looking at his daughter the wrong way. That was 1840. I've been waiting 7 years for someone with the stomach to see it through." Ezekiel studied her face, searching for any trace of the subservient kitchen slave he thought he knew. What he found instead was something ancient and implacable, a hatred so pure it had crystallized into something resembling religious devotion. "What are you proposing?" Sarah's grin widened. "I'm proposing to make your task easier. The family trusts me in their kitchen, lets me handle their food, their drink. A few herbs mixed into their evening wine, and they'll sleep so deep that Gabriel's trumpet couldn't wake them. No struggle, no screaming to alert the neighbors. You can take your time, do what needs doing proper." The offer was tempting, but Ezekiel found himself shaking his head. "No, this has to be personal. They need to see it coming, need to understand why it's happening. Fear is part of the payment they owe." Sarah's expression shifted, respect replacing the calculating gleam in her eyes. "You got more backbone than I gave you credit for. But you sure you don't want insurance? These walls hide more secrets than just your parentage. I could show you things that would make your revenge taste even sweeter." "What kind of secrets?" "The kind that would make you understand you ain't the only bastard child running around this plantation. Master Whitmore's appetites run deeper than you know, and his sons learned their lessons well." She leaned closer, her voice dropping to barely audible. "That pretty little housemaid, Jenny? She carrying young Master Robert's child, and Miss Catherine's personal servant. She'd been warming Master William's bed since she turned 14. The revelation hit Ezekiel like a sledgehammer. The systematic abuse he had discovered wasn't an isolated incident, but a family tradition passed down through generations. The full scope of the Whitmore family's evil began to crystallize in his mind, each new understanding adding weight to the scales of justice he intended to balance. "I appreciate the offer," Ezekiel said finally, "but this is something I need to do alone." "My way," Sarah nodded slowly, tucking the voodoo charm back into her dress. "I understand, but if you change your mind, you know where to find me." The annual harvest feast was set for December 23rd, a tradition the Whitmore family had maintained for 15 years to celebrate another profitable season of cotton and the approaching Christmas holiday. The grand dining room would be decorated with holly and magnolia branches, the mahogany table laden with the finest china and crystal, and the family would gather to toast their continued prosperity built upon the broken backs of human chattel. For Ezekiel, it represented the perfect convergence of opportunity and symbolism, the very table where they celebrated their wealth extracted from his people's suffering would become the altar of his revenge. The timing felt ordained by whatever dark gods might favor such justice. 2 nights before the feast, Ezekiel began his final preparations with the methodical precision of a craftsman approaching his masterwork. He waited until the house settled into its deepest sleep before slipping through the servants' entrance he had used thousands of times, but tonight carried a different significance. Tonight, he moved through these familiar spaces as a predator rather than prey. The basement of the main house, used primarily for root cellars and wine storage, would serve as his workshop. The stone walls would muffle sound, and the heavy oak door could be barred from the inside. More importantly, the room contained everything he would need for the work ahead: butcher's blocks, hanging hooks, sharp knives, and even a meat grinder that the family used for sausage making during the winter months. Working by candlelight, Ezekiel arranged his tools with surgical precision. The stolen kitchen knife, honed to razor sharpness over weeks of patient work, lay beside a collection of carving implements he had gradually accumulated. Lengths of rope, tested for strength and knotted at precise intervals, coiled beside iron shackles salvaged from the old slave quarters. Everything had its place, its purpose, its role in the symphony of retribution he was preparing to conduct. The mahogany dining table upstairs drew his attention next. He had served countless meals across its polished surface, watching the family feast while he and his people survived on scraps. Tonight he traced his fingers along its length, measuring, planning, visualizing how it would look tomorrow evening when it served a very different kind of meal. He knew every inch of the house's layout from years of cleaning and serving. The master bedroom, where Cornelius Whitmore slept off his nightly bourbon consumption, occupied the northeast corner of the second floor. His wife Martha preferred the adjoining room, claiming her husband's snoring disturbed her delicate constitution. Their eldest son, Robert, maintained a room on the same floor, while William, barely 18, slept in the converted attic space that gave him privacy for his nocturnal activities with the house servants. The servants' quarters buzzed with activity during normal evening hours, but by midnight, exhaustion claimed even the most wakeful souls. Only Sarah maintained her vigil in the kitchen, claiming she needed to prepare bread dough for the morning, though Ezekiel suspected her true purpose involved ingredients that would never appear in any cookbook. As he moved through the darkened hallways, Ezekiel felt a strange calm descend upon him. The rage that had sustained him through months of planning crystallized into something colder and more focused. This wasn't madness or passion, it was justice distilled to its purest form, served at precisely the right temperature. In the wine cellar, he selected several bottles of the family's finest vintage, the same bottles they would drink tomorrow night to toast their continued prosperity. But these particular bottles would serve a different purpose. Using skills learned from watching Sarah mix her herbal remedies, he carefully inserted thin needles through the cork, adding measured drops of a sedative tincture she had provided despite his refusal of her larger offer. The preparation was delicate work that required steady hands and precise timing. Too much of the mixture, and his prey would die before the evening began. Too little, and they might wake at inconvenient moments. The balance had to be perfect, just enough to ensure compliance without robbing them of consciousness during the crucial moments when understanding would dawn. By 3 in the morning, everything was ready. The basement workshop waited like a theater prepared for its final performance. The drugged wine sat in the cellar, indistinguishable from its innocent companions. The dining room table gleamed with fresh polish, ready to display tomorrow evening's feast in all its horrific glory. Ezekiel returned to his cabin as the first hints of dawn touched the eastern sky. Tomorrow night, the harvest feast would indeed celebrate a bounty, though not the kind the Whitmore family anticipated. As he lay on his narrow cot, staring at the ceiling where shadows danced like omens, he whispered a prayer to his mother's spirit. "Tomorrow, Mama. Tomorrow they pay for what they done to you. To us. To all of us." The mahogany table waited in patient darkness, ready to host its final, most memorable dinner party. The evening of December 23rd arrived with unseasonable warmth that seemed to mock the approaching winter solstice. Inside the grand dining room of Thornfield Plantation, candles flickered against crystal and silver while the Whitmore family gathered for their annual harvest feast, blissfully unaware that they were attending their own funeral dinner. Master Cornelius Whitmore raised his wineglass with the expansive gesture of a man celebrating another year of profitable cruelty. "To family prosperity," he declared, his voice carrying the satisfaction of someone who had never questioned his right to build wealth upon human suffering. "May the coming year bring us even greater returns on our investments." The toast was echoed by his wife Martha, a thin woman whose beauty had long since been consumed by the bitterness required to maintain willful blindness to her husband's appetites. Their sons Robert and William, aged 24 and 18 respectively, drank deeply from glasses that sealed their fate with each swallow. Ezekiel moved through the room with practiced invisibility, refilling glasses and removing plates, while death worked its way through their bloodstream, disguised as fine vintage wine. Sarah's sedative worked with patient efficiency, causing eyelids to grow heavy and words to slur just enough to seem like the natural progression of a festive evening. By 10 o'clock, the family's animated conversation had dissolved into drowsy contentment. Martha was the first to excuse herself, claiming fatigue from the day's preparations. She made it halfway up the main staircase before the drug claimed her, her body crumpling gracefully onto the carpeted steps like a discarded evening gown. Robert followed 20 minutes later, his young wife having already departed for her parents' home the previous day. He managed to reach his bedroom door before unconsciousness took hold, his body sliding down the mahogany panels to rest in an undignified heap upon the Persian rug his mother had imported from Charleston. Young William proved more resistant to the sedative, his youth and constitution fighting against the chemical invasion. He made it to the back porch before his legs betrayed him, his unconscious form sprawling across the wooden boards where generations of Whitmores had sat in judgment of their human property master. Whitmore himself displayed the stubborn endurance that had served him through 52 years of inflicting misery upon others. Even as his vision blurred and his limbs grew heavy, he sensed something amiss in the evening's progression. His pale blue eyes, mirror images of those that gazed back at him from his bastard son's face, struggled to focus on Ezekiel's form moving through the dining room. "Something's not right," he mumbled, his words thick as molasses. "Sarah." He'd called Tobias, but Sarah had vanished into the kitchen, and Tobias lay unconscious in his cabin, having sampled the same drugged wine during his own private celebration. Whitmore was alone with the child he had created through rape and tormented through 23 years of existence. "Hello, Father," Ezekiel said quietly, setting down the empty wine decanter and allowing his mask of subservience to fall away. "Time we had that conversation about family obligations." The word father struck Whitmore like a physical blow. Even through the chemical haze clouding his mind, the implications penetrated with crystal clarity. His eyes widened with a mixture of understanding and terror as he recognized the intelligence that had always lurked behind his property's apparent docility. You can't." Whitmore struggled to form words as his body refused to obey his commands. "You're my property, your son," Ezekiel corrected, his voice carrying the cold satisfaction of a debt finally coming due. "Your blood, your legacy, everything you made me to be." Working with methodical efficiency, Ezekiel bound each family member with the rope he had prepared, their unconscious forms offering no resistance as he secured them to chairs arranged around the mahogany dining table. The sedative would wear off within the hour, providing just enough consciousness for them to understand their situation without the strength to escape it. He retrieved his tools from the basement workshop, arranging them on the sideboard with the same care Sarah used when preparing elaborate meals. The kitchen knife gleamed in the candlelight beside bone saws and carving implements that would serve purposes their makers never intended. When Master Whitmore's eyes finally opened, the first thing he saw was his own reflection distorted in the blade of the knife that would end his life. Ezekiel knelt beside his father's chair, studying the face that had haunted his dreams and mirrors for 23 years. "Before we begin," Ezekiel whispered, "I want you to know that your wife and children are going to watch. They're going to understand exactly what kind of monster they've been protecting, what kind of evil they've been profiting from. And then they're going to join you." The collection of personal effects he had gathered over the months, watches, jewelry, family heirlooms, lay arranged on the table like offerings to some dark god of retribution. Each piece would serve as a trophy, a reminder of the night when justice finally came to Thornfield Plantation wearing the face of its own sins. Dawn broke over Thornfield Plantation with the pale, reluctant light of a winter morning that seemed to recoil from what it might illuminate. The mockingbirds, usually abundant in their cheerful songs, remained silent in the oak trees that surrounded the main house. Even nature itself appeared to sense that something fundamental had shifted during the dark hours before sunrise. Colonel Matthews and his wife arrived at precisely 11 o'clock. Their carriage wheels crunching across the frost-covered gravel drive with the confidence of people expecting warm welcomes and generous hospitality. They had come to collect Judge Harrison and his wife, planning to continue their Christmas social rounds with a pleasant morning visit to their dear friends, the Whitmores. The front door stood slightly ajar, which struck Colonel Matthews as odd, given the December chill. But he attributed it to servants preparing for their arrival. He knocked twice, the sound echoing hollowly through what should have been a house bustling with morning activity. "Cornelius?" he called out, stepping across the threshold into the grand foyer. "Martha? We're here to collect the Harrisons." The silence that greeted him felt dense with wrongness. No scurrying servants, no clatter of breakfast preparation from the kitchen, no sounds of a household beginning its daily routine. Even the grandfather clock in the hallway had stopped, its hands frozen at 3:17. Mrs. Matthews clutched her husband's arm as they moved deeper into the house, their footsteps unnaturally loud against the polished hardwood floors. The morning light, streaming through tall windows, seemed to illuminate dust motes that danced like spirits fleeing some unspeakable scene. They found the dining room, the mahogany table, which had hosted countless elegant dinners and refined conversations about the superiority of Southern civilization, now displayed a feast that would haunt their nightmares for whatever brief time remained to them. Fine bone china held portions of meat that no cookbook would ever describe, arranged with the artistic precision of someone who had taken pride in their work. Four-place settings remained empty, napkins folded with perfect attention to detail beside silverware that gleamed with recent polishing. At the head of the table, a single white rose had been placed beside a folded note written in careful script. "Justice has been served. The debt is paid in full." Mrs. Matthews' scream shattered the morning silence like breaking glass. She collapsed against her husband's chest, her mind refusing to process the evidence before her eyes. Colonel Matthews, a veteran of the Mexican War who had seen battlefields strewn with the dead, found himself retching onto the Persian rug as understanding dawned. The Whitmore family was gone, not fled, not kidnapped, not murdered in any conventional sense. They had been transformed into the very feast they would have enjoyed, served upon their own table with the same attention to presentation they had always demanded from their kitchen staff. "Dear God," Matthews whispered, his voice barely audible through his horror. "What kind of monster?" The answer lay in the details only someone intimate with the household could have orchestrated. The wine glasses still held dregs of the same vintage the family had been drinking the night before. The candles had burned down to stubs, suggesting the meal preparation had taken many hours. Most disturbing of all, the precise arrangement suggested not madness, but a calculated ritual performed by someone who understood exactly what they were doing and why. A thorough search of the house revealed no sign of the perpetrator. The slave quarters sat empty. Their inhabitants vanished like smoke into the Georgia wilderness. Only Sarah's cabin showed signs of hasty departure, herbs scattered across the floor, her grandmother's voodoo charms missing from their hiding places, and a message scrawled in charcoal across the wooden wall: "The spirits have been fed." Judge Harrison's body was discovered in the guest bedroom, having never made it to the dining room the previous evening. Unlike the Whitmore family, he had been killed cleanly, almost mercifully, suggesting his death had been incidental to the main event rather than part of the elaborate revenge. The local sheriff, a nervous man named Pemberton, who had never investigated anything more serious than stolen livestock, found himself facing a crime that defied all rational explanation. The physical evidence pointed to careful planning by someone with intimate knowledge of the household, but the sheer audacity and horror of the act suggested a mind that had snapped under pressures no civilized person could imagine. Within hours, riders carried news of the massacre to every plantation within 50 miles. The story spread like wildfire through the network of Southern gentility, each telling adding new embellishments and theories. Some whispered of slave uprisings, others of supernatural vengeance, but all agreed on one terrifying truth. Somewhere in the wilderness of Georgia, a monster walked free, carrying the skills and hatred necessary to turn their own slaves against them in the most horrific way imaginable. The single white rose on each empty plate became the signature of a legend that would haunt the South for generations, a symbol that justice could take forms more terrible than any law had ever conceived. 3 days had passed since Ezekiel disappeared into the vast Georgia wilderness, leaving behind the smoldering ruins of everything the Whitmore family had built upon the backs of human suffering. The December cold bit through his stolen coat as he made his way through dense pine forests that had never known the touch of axe or plow, following deer paths and creek beds that led ever deeper into the untamed heart of the territory. Behind him, Thornfield Plantation buzzed with activity that would have been unthinkable during the family's reign. Sheriff Pemberton had arrived with a contingent of men from 3 neighboring counties, their faces grim, with the knowledge that they hunted something far more dangerous than any common criminal. Dogs bayed in the distance, their voices carrying the frustrated confusion of hounds who had lost a scent that seemed to vanish like smoke whenever they drew close. Ezekiel paused beside a creek swollen with winter runoff, kneeling to cup the icy water in his hands and drink deeply. The cold burned his throat, but it also cleansed him of the last traces of smoke and blood that had clung to him since that final night. In the rippling surface of the water, he caught a glimpse of his reflection and barely recognized the face that stared back. The features remained the same, the mixed heritage that had marked him as belonging nowhere, the pale eyes inherited from a father who had never acknowledged him. But something fundamental had changed in the depths of those eyes, something that spoke of a transformation far more profound than mere freedom. The broken slave who had knelt in cotton fields while dreams of revenge sustained him through endless suffering no longer existed. In his place stood something that defied easy categorization, neither fully human nor entirely monster, but possessed of a terrible clarity about the nature of justice. In a world built upon cruelty, the leather satchel he carried contained the personal effects he had taken as trophies: Master Whitmore's gold pocket watch, Martha's pearl brooch, Robert's signet ring, and young William's silver cufflinks. Each piece represented not just a life ended, but a cycle of abuse finally broken. They were proof that the powerful could be made to pay for their sins, that even the most entrenched systems of oppression could be overturned by someone with sufficient will and hatred. As evening approached, Ezekiel found shelter beneath a granite overhang that would hide his small fire from searching eyes. He had learned survival skills during his years of slavery, knowledge passed down from old Moses and other slaves who had attempted escape in earlier years. The wilderness held dangers, but they were honest dangers: cold, hunger, wild animals, rather than the calculated cruelty of men who justified their evil with law and custom. That night, as stars emerged in the clear December sky, Ezekiel allowed himself to remember his mother for the first time since learning the truth of his origins. She remained a mystery to him, a woman whose name he had never learned, whose voice he had never heard, whose love he had never known. But in the crackling flames of his campfire, he imagined her spirit watching over him with approval rather than horror. She had died, bringing him into a world that wanted nothing more than to destroy him. But instead of being destroyed, he had become the destroyer. Instead of remaining a victim, he had transformed into an instrument of retribution, so perfect that it would be whispered about in slave quarters and plantation houses for generations to come. The sound of distant dogs reached his ears again, closer now, but still confused by the cold that froze scent and the rocky terrain that left no clear tracks. Ezekiel smiled, the expression that would have terrified anyone who witnessed it. Let them hunt. Let them search every cave and hollow in Georgia. The man they sought had ceased to exist the moment he placed that first white rose on an empty dinner plate. He pulled the stolen coat tighter around his shoulders and settled back against the granite wall, listening to the night sounds of the forest that had become his new kingdom. Tomorrow he would continue north, following rumors of communities where men like him could disappear entirely. Places where questions about the past were considered poor manners and survival skills mattered more than pedigree. But tonight, he would rest in the satisfaction of knowing that somewhere behind him, powerful men were learning to fear the dark. The small settlement of Pine Hollow existed in the kind of deliberate obscurity that attracted men with pasts they preferred to forget. Nestled in a valley between two ridges of the Appalachian foothills, it consisted of perhaps 20 ramshackle buildings connected by muddy paths that had never seen surveyors' instruments or government oversight. Here, a man's name was whatever he claimed it to be, and his business remained his own as long as he caused no trouble for his neighbors. Ezekiel arrived on a bitter January morning after 2 weeks of following mountain trails that seemed to exist more in rumor than reality. The settlement's residents watched his approach with the careful attention of people who had learned to evaluate strangers for both opportunity and threat. His clothes marked him as neither wealthy nor destitute. His bearing suggested competence without arrogance, and most importantly, his eyes held the particular emptiness that marked a man who had already lost everything worth losing. The settlement's unofficial leader, a grizzled mountain man named Jeremiah Cates, emerged from what passed for a general store to study the newcomer. Gates had fled Kentucky 10 years earlier after a disagreement with revenue agents over the taxation of his whiskey production, and he possessed the keen instincts of someone who had survived by reading men's intentions in their faces. "Morning." "Stranger," Cates called out, his hand resting casually on the pistol at his belt. "You got business in Pine Hollow, or you just passing through?" Ezekiel stopped 20 feet away, far enough to avoid seeming threatening, but close enough to demonstrate he felt no fear. "Looking for work and a place to winter over." He'd tell this was the kind of place that judged a man by his hands instead of his history. The answer seemed to satisfy Cates, who relaxed slightly and gestured toward the collection of buildings that constituted their community. "We got need for someone good with tools. Old Henrik passed last month, and his smithy's been sitting cold. You know anything about metalwork?" "Some," Ezekiel replied, though his knowledge came from years of watching plantation smiths repair chains and shackles rather than formal apprenticeship. "I learn fast, and I don't ask questions about other folks' business." That final statement carried particular weight in a community built upon mutual discretion. Gates nodded approvingly and extended a weathered hand. "Name's Jeremiah. Folks call me Jerry. You got a name you're partial to?" For a moment, Ezekiel considered the question. The name his mother had given him belonged to a different life, a different world, where slaves bore biblical names as a cruel joke about their supposed salvation through servitude. But he couldn't bring himself to abandon it entirely. It was the only gift she had ever been able to give him. Ezekiel, he said finally. Ezekiel Mason. The surname came from somewhere deep in his memory, perhaps overheard in conversations about free blacks who had taken trades' names when slavery was legally ended in northern states. It felt solid in his mouth, respectable in a way his previous existence had never allowed. Jerry led him through the settlement, pointing out the various enterprises that kept Pine Hollow economically viable despite its isolation. There was a still hidden in a cave system that produced whiskey, traded as far south as Atlanta, a lumber mill that processed trees too remote for larger operations to bother with, and several small farms that raised crops requiring minimal oversight from government inspectors. The smithy sat at the settlement's edge, its stone chimney cold, but its forge and tools still in serviceable condition. Hendrik had been a skilled craftsman who understood that isolated communities needed someone capable of repairing everything from horseshoes to rifle barrels without asking uncomfortable questions about their origins or intended uses. Place comes with a cabin out back, Jerry explained, gesturing toward a small but solid structure that seemed palatial compared to the slave quarters Ezekiel had called home for 23 years. Henrik's widow moved back to Tennessee to live with her sister, left everything here rather than try to haul it over mountain roads. That evening, as Ezekiel explored his new home by lamplight, he discovered Henrik's tools, arranged with the care of a man who understood that his livelihood depended upon their condition. Among them, wrapped in oiled cloth and hidden beneath the workbench, he found Henrik's hammer, a perfectly balanced piece of steel that had been passed down through 3 generations of blacksmiths. The wooden handle showed the wear patterns of decades of use, smooth as silk, where countless hands had gripped it during the patient work of shaping metal to human will. As he held the hammer, feeling its weight and balance, Ezekiel understood that he had found more than just a tool. He had discovered an identity that would allow him to rebuild his life on foundations of honest labor rather than the shifting sands of revenge and hatred. Spring arrived in Pine Hollow with the gradual warmth that mountain communities learned to treasure after brutal winters. Ezekiel had spent the cold months establishing himself as Henrik's worthy successor, his natural aptitude for metalwork developing into genuine skill under the patient guidance of Jerry Cates and other settlers who remembered the old blacksmith's techniques. The rhythm of hammer against anvil had become a meditation, each strike releasing tensions that had accumulated over a lifetime of forced servitude. The settlement's acceptance of their new smith came slowly but surely, earned through competent work and careful discretion about the pasts that had driven each resident to seek refuge in these remote mountains. Ezekiel repaired tools without questioning their condition, sharpened knives without asking about their intended use, and crafted horseshoes for animals that might have been stolen from distant plantations. The unspoken code of Pine Hollow demanded only that each man pull his weight and keep his mouth shut about his neighbor's business. On a warm April morning, while Ezekiel worked at his forge repairing a broken axle for Tom Bradley's wagon, a stranger rode into the settlement with the purposeful bearing of someone following a specific trail rather than wandering aimlessly through the mountains. The man wore the dusty clothes of a professional tracker. His horse showed signs of hard travel, and most concerning of all, he carried the kind of official papers that spelled trouble for communities built upon anonymity. Jerry Cates intercepted the stranger before he could reach the smithy, but Ezekiel could hear their conversation clearly through the open doors of his workshop. The tracker introduced himself as Marshal Fletcher, operating under federal authority to investigate crimes that had crossed state boundaries. He carried sketches and descriptions of various fugitives, including one that made Ezekiel's blood run cold with recognition, looking for a colored man. Mixed heritage, probably calling himself by a different name now, Fletcher explained. his voice carrying the professional detachment of someone who hunted humans for a living. About 23 years old, tall build, distinctive scars on his back from whipping. Wanted in connection with the Thornfield Plantation massacre down in Georgia, Ezekiel continued working at his forge. But his movements became more deliberate. His attention focused on every word of the conversation, taking place 50 yards away. The marshal described the crime in clinical terms that stripped away all context of the years of abuse that had preceded it, reducing his acts of justice to simple murder and mutilation. Killed an entire family in their sleep, then butchered them like animals, Fletcher continued. Arranged the remains as some kind of twisted feast. The local authorities believe he's working his way north, probably trying to reach territories where federal law enforcement has limited reach. Jerry's response carried the careful neutrality that mountain communities had perfected when dealing with outside authority. Can't say we've seen anyone matching that description, Marshal. Pine Hollow doesn't get many visitors, and we tend to remember strangers. But you're welcome to look around if you've got legal cause. The marshal spent 2 hours searching the settlement, interviewing residents who provided him with nothing more useful than polite cooperation and genuine ignorance. When he reached the smithy, Ezekiel continued his work without looking up, letting the heat from the forge explain any perspiration that might betray his nervousness. "You the new smith?" Fletcher asked, studying Ezekiel with professional interest. "Yes, sir," Ezekiel replied, keeping his voice steady and his eyes focused on the red-hot iron he was shaping. "Name's Ezekiel Mason. Been here since January. Took over when old Henrik passed." Fletcher circled the forge, noting the quality of work displayed on the walls and the obvious signs of legitimate craftsmanship. "You're lighter skinned than most colored folk I've encountered. Mixed heritage? My mother was a house slave, my father was." Ezekiel paused, allowing calculated hesitation to suggest embarrassment rather than deception. "Well, sir, you know how these things happen on plantations. I was freed when my master died, came north looking for honest work. The story contained enough truth to ring authentic while omitting the crucial details that would have ended Ezekiel's new life before it could truly begin." Fletcher seemed satisfied with the explanation, particularly when Jerry vouched for the smith's character and work ethic. After the marshal departed, riding south toward the next settlement on his list, Ezekiel found himself staring at the piece of iron he had been shaping during the interrogation. Without conscious intention, his hammer had transformed the raw metal into something resembling a rose, its petals formed by careful strikes that spoke to skills he hadn't realized he possessed. The iron rose sat cooling on his anvil, a reminder that even in his new life, the past followed him like a shadow that no amount of honest labor could entirely dispel. Summer brought an unexpected visitor to Pine Hollow in the form of Rebecca Ashford, a young woman whose arrival disrupted the settlement's carefully maintained isolation in ways that had nothing to do with law enforcement or unwelcome questions about the past. She appeared one July morning, leading a pack mule loaded with medical supplies and books, her plain dress and practical demeanor marking her as someone accustomed to self-reliance, rather than dependence upon others for survival. Rebecca had come to the mountains fleeing her own form of bondage, an arranged marriage to a Charleston banker 3 times her age, orchestrated by a father more interested in consolidating business partnerships than considering his daughter's happiness. At 26, she possessed the education of a lady and the practical skills of someone who had been forced to fend for herself. Having studied medicine under her uncle's tutelage before social convention demanded she abandon such unseemly pursuits, the settlement welcomed her, a rival with the cautious optimism of people who understood the value of someone trained to treat injuries and illnesses that were occupational hazards of life beyond civilization's protective boundaries. Jerry Cates provided her with Henrik's old cabin, reasoning that the deceased blacksmith's widow would approve of her former home, serving someone dedicated to preserving life rather than merely surviving it. Ezekiel first encountered Rebecca when she brought her mule to his smithy, requiring new shoes for an animal that had carried her across mountain trails, rough enough to damage even the sturdiest horseshoes. She waited in the shade while he worked, reading from a leather-bound medical text that had seen considerable use during her journey north. Interesting reading for someone traveling through wilderness, Ezekiel commented, as he heated iron to the proper temperature for shaping. Rebecca looked up from her book with eyes that held intelligence sharpened by experience rather than mere education. Knowledge of anatomy proves useful in more situations than most people realize. Understanding how bodies work helps whether you're trying to heal them or... She paused, perhaps recognizing that her words could be interpreted in ways she hadn't intended. Or break them, Ezekiel finished quietly, his hammer striking the anvil with precise rhythm. I imagine anatomy knowledge serves many purposes. Something in his tone made Rebecca study his face more carefully, noting details she had initially overlooked. The mixed heritage that marked him as neither fully accepted by white society nor entirely belonging to black communities. The particular quality of stillness that came from years of suppressing natural reactions to remain invisible. Most telling of all, the controlled precision of his movements that suggested training in violence as well as metalwork. You speak like someone with education beyond what most blacksmiths require, she observed, closing her book but keeping one finger marking her place. Ezekiel continued his work, allowing silence to stretch between them before responding. A man learns what he needs to survive. Some lessons come from books, others from harder teachers. Over the following weeks, Rebecca established herself as Pine Hollow's unofficial physician, treating everything from infected wounds to difficult births with competence that impressed even the settlement's most skeptical residents. Her medical bag, inherited from her uncle along with his knowledge, contained instruments and supplies that represented years of accumulated wisdom about the human body's capacity for both healing and harm. She developed a particular friendship with Ezekiel, drawn by his quiet intelligence and the sense that he understood suffering in ways that went beyond mere physical pain. Their conversations, conducted while he worked at his forge and she tended to various patients, revealed complementary perspectives on the nature of justice and mercy. I've seen what men do to each other when they believe law and custom give them license, Rebecca said one evening as she cleaned instruments by lamplight. In Charleston, I treated slave women who had been used in ways that would horrify decent people if decent people bothered to acknowledge what happened behind closed doors. Ezekiel's hammer paused in its rhythm. And what did you do about it? What I could. Healing what could be healed, comforting what couldn't be cured, and sometimes, she held up a small vial filled with clear liquid, sometimes providing options for those who couldn't endure another day of what passed for their normal existence. The vial contained enough poison to kill a man quickly and quietly, disguised among her legitimate medical supplies, but available for purposes that went far beyond healing. It represented the darker side of medical knowledge, the understanding that sometimes the greatest mercy involved ending suffering rather than prolonging it. Mercy and justice aren't always the same thing, Rebecca continued, meeting Ezekiel's eyes directly. Sometimes they require very different tools. In that moment, both recognized in the other a kindred spirit who understood that survival sometimes demanded choices that comfortable people never had to contemplate. The autumn of 1848 brought news that rippled through Pine Hollow like stones thrown into still water, disturbing the careful peace that Ezekiel had constructed around his new identity. A traveling merchant named Carson arrived with supplies and gossip from the wider world, his wagon loaded with goods and his tongue loose with stories that made the isolated settlement feel suddenly vulnerable to forces beyond their control. "They're still hunting that Thornfield killer," Carson announced over evening drinks at Jerry's cabin, his voice carrying the satisfaction of someone who enjoyed being the bearer of dramatic news. Marshall's been through every settlement between here and the Tennessee border. Got reward posters nailed to trees from Georgia clear up to Virginia. $500 for information leading to his capture. Ezekiel continued, whittling a piece of oak into a tool handle, his knife moving with steady precision, while his mind processed the implications of Carson's words. $500 represented more money than most Pine Hollow residents had seen in their entire lives. Enough to tempt even the most loyal neighbor if times grew hard enough. What kind of information they looking for? Jerry asked with the casual interest of someone making conversation rather than seeking intelligence. About a potential threat to his community's stability. Carson reached into his coat and withdrew a folded paper. That made Ezekiel's blood turn to ice water. The reward poster contained a surprisingly accurate sketch of his face, drawn from descriptions provided by survivors of the Thornfield investigation. Beneath the image, text described his physical characteristics with the precision of a slave auction advertisement. Mixed-race male, approximately 24 years old, 6 feet tall, distinctive scars on back from whipping, last seen fleeing north from Georgia. They got witnesses who seen him around Savannah back in January, Carson continued, studying the poster with professional interest. Seems he tried to book passage on a ship heading north, but something spooked him before he could board. Captain remembered him because of his eyes, said they were the coldest things he'd ever seen on a human face. The description struck uncomfortably close to accuracy, though Ezekiel had never been near Savannah. Someone matching his general appearance had apparently attempted to flee the country, drawing attention that now threatened every mixed-race man between Georgia and the Canadian border. Rebecca, who had been quietly mending a torn shirt by lamplight, looked up with carefully controlled expression. What did this man supposedly do that merits such extensive pursuit? Carson's grin revealed teeth stained by tobacco and neglect. Butchered a whole family like hogs for slaughter, then served them up as supper on their own dining table. Some kind of revenge killing, they figure. Probably a slave who snapped under mistreatment. The details would turn your stomach, Miss Ashford. Not fit conversation for a lady's ears? I've treated battlefield wounds and difficult births, Rebecca replied dryly. My stomach proves more resilient than you might imagine. But such extreme violence suggests someone driven beyond rational thought by circumstances we can hardly comprehend. Her words carried subtle weight that wasn't lost on Ezekiel, who recognized her attempt to shift the conversation toward understanding rather than condemnation. But Carson seemed oblivious to the undercurrents, focused entirely on the dramatic elements of the story that made for entertaining telling. Rational or not, he's dangerous as a rabid wolf, Carson declared. Marshall Fletcher. That's the federal man leading the hunt. He told me this killer's got skills that make him more dangerous than any ordinary criminal. Knows how to disappear in wilderness, how to live off land most folks couldn't survive in for a week. That night, after Carson had settled into Jerry's barn for sleep and the settlement had quieted into darkness, Ezekiel found the reward poster nailed to a tree near the main trail. Someone had posted it while he worked at his forge. Perhaps Carson himself, or one of the settlers who had begun viewing their neighbors with newfound suspicion. He studied his own face, rendered in charcoal and ink, noting how the artist had captured something in his eyes that he hadn't realized others could perceive. The sketch looked like a wanted poster for a different person, someone harder and more dangerous than the quiet blacksmith who had earned Pine Hollow's tentative acceptance through honest labor and careful discretion. But as he stared at the image, Ezekiel understood that the difference was largely illusion. The man who had methodically planned and executed the Thornfield massacre still lived beneath the surface of Ezekiel Mason, blacksmith and respected community member. The skills that had enabled his revenge remained intact, waiting like weapons in an armory for circumstances that might require their use again. The reward poster felt like parchment beneath his fingers as he carefully folded it and tucked it inside his coat. A reminder that the past never truly released. its grip on those who had committed acts too. Extreme for forgiveness or forgetting, the winter of 1848 settled over Pine, hollow with an intensity that seemed to mirror the growing tension within Ezekiel's carefully constructed new life. Snow fell earlier and heavier than usual, isolating the settlement from the outside world, while forcing its residents to rely entirely upon each other for survival. It was during these long, dark months that Ezekiel discovered the true depth of Rebecca's knowledge about the darker applications of medical science. The revelation came when Tom Bradley's youngest son fell, ill with a fever that conventional remedies couldn't touch. The boy, barely 8 years old, burned with an internal heat that threatened to consume him while his parents watched helplessly. Rebecca worked tirelessly at his bedside, applying every technique her uncle had taught her, but nothing seemed capable of breaking the fever that held the child in its grip. On the third night of the boy's illness, when death seemed inevitable despite Rebecca's efforts, she appeared at Ezekiel's cabin carrying her medical bag and an expression of grim determination that he had never seen before. "I need your help," she said without preamble, setting her bag on his kitchen table with careful deliberation. "What I'm about to do requires absolute secrecy, and I need someone I trust to assist me." Ezekiel studied her face in the lamplight, noting the exhaustion that came from days of fighting a losing battle against disease. "What kind of help?" Rebecca opened her bag and withdrew items that seemed distinctly out of place among conventional medical instruments. A small brass scale for measuring minute quantities, vials of substances that gave off faint but disturbing odors, and most unsettling of all, a leather-bound journal filled with notes written in a code that disguised their true meaning. "My uncle taught me more than conventional medicine," she said, her voice dropping to barely above a whisper. He understood that sometimes healing requires techniques that would horrify those who haven't watched children die from diseases that shouldn't exist. "The boy's fever isn't natural. Someone poisoned him." The accusation struck Ezekiel like a physical blow. Pine Hollow had seemed immune to the kind of calculated evil that had defined his previous existence. But Rebecca's words suggested that malice could find root even in communities built upon mutual protection and isolation. Who would poison a child? Rebecca's laugh held no humor whatsoever. "Someone who wants to watch Tom Bradley suffer. Someone who knows that killing a man's son causes more pain than simply killing the man himself. I've seen this particular poison before. It mimics fever while slowly destroying the body from within." She opened her coded journal to a page filled with symbols and abbreviated notes that looked more like alchemical formulas than medical prescriptions. The journal represented years of accumulated knowledge about substances that existed at the intersection of healing and harm. Remedies that could save lives or end them, depending upon dosage and application. "The antidote requires ingredients that most physicians wouldn't keep," Rebecca continued, measuring tiny amounts of various powders with the brass scale. "Substances that have legitimate medical uses in proper quantities, but become deadly weapons when concentrated or combined incorrectly." As she worked, Rebecca explained the poisoning symptoms with clinical precision that revealed uncomfortable familiarity with such cases. The fever that couldn't be broken, the delirium that prevented the victim from identifying his attacker, and most tellingly, the gradual organ failure that would eventually claim the boy's life while appearing to be natural illness. "How do you know so much about poison?" Ezekiel asked, though part of him already suspected the answer. "Because I've used it," Rebecca replied matter-of-factly, never looking up from her careful measurements. 3 times to be precise. Men who thought their wealth and position gave them license to abuse women under their power. Men who would never face justice through legal channels because their victims were considered property rather than people. The admission hung between them like smoke from a funeral pyre, heavy with implications that went far beyond the immediate crisis of Tom Bradley's dying son. Ezekiel understood that Rebecca's knowledge of poison represented something far more personal than academic study. It was the accumulated wisdom of someone who had been forced to become her own instrument of justice, working together through the night. They prepared an antidote that required precise timing and careful administration. The brass scale became the crucial tool that meant the difference between saving the boy's life and accidentally ending it, each measurement requiring absolute accuracy to neutralize the poison without creating new dangers. By dawn, Tom Bradley's son was sleeping peacefully, his fever finally broken after 3 days of burning. But the questions raised by his recovery would prove far more dangerous than the poison that had nearly claimed his life. The identity of Tom Bradley's son's poisoner revealed itself 3 weeks after the boy's recovery, when Carson, the traveling merchant, returned to Pine Hollow with supplies and a demeanor that had shifted from jovial storytelling to nervous calculation. His eyes moved constantly as he conducted his business, and Ezekiel noticed how the man's hands trembled when he thought no one was watching. Rebecca had been monitoring the settlement for signs of whoever had attempted to murder an innocent child, her medical training allowing her to observe behavioral changes that others might dismiss as winter restlessness or cabin fever. Carson's obvious anxiety, combined with his detailed questions about the boy's miraculous recovery, painted a picture that became clearer with each suspicious inquiry. "Heard young Bradley made a remarkable turnaround," Carson mentioned to Jerry while unloading his wagon, his voice carrying forced casualness that fooled no one who listened carefully. "Amazing how children can bounce back from illness that would kill a grown man. Makes you wonder what kind of medicine Miss Ashford practices up here in the mountains." Jerry's response held the protective edge that Pine Hollow residents reserved for threats against their community. Miss Ashford saved the boy's life using skills learned from years of proper training. Amazing what real medicine can accomplish when it's practiced by someone who actually knows what they're doing. That evening, while Carson slept in Jerry's barn, Rebecca and Ezekiel conducted a careful search of his belongings. Hidden beneath false compartments in his supply crates, they discovered a collection of substances that confirmed their worst suspicions. Vials of concentrated poisons, measuring devices for precise dosages, and most damning of all, a ledger documenting payments received for special services provided to clients whose problems required permanent solutions. The ledger entries were written in the same careful code that Rebecca used for her own dangerous remedies. But years of studying such systems allowed her to decipher enough to understand Carson's true profession. He wasn't merely a traveling merchant. He was a professional poisoner who used his legitimate business as cover for a much more lucrative trade in death. "Tom Bradley's name appears 3 times, Rebecca whispered, holding the ledger close to their shielded candle flame. "Someone paid Carson $50 to eliminate the boy, with specific instructions that it appear to be natural illness. The client is identified only as the creditor." The mysterious client's identity became clear when they discovered correspondence hidden in Carson's personal effects. Letters written on expensive stationery and signed with the elaborate flourish of someone accustomed to wielding authority revealed that Carson's employer was none other than Judge Harrison's younger brother, Edmund Harrison, a Charleston banker with interests in several mountain communities. The letters detailed a complex scheme involving fraudulent loans and forged documents designed to seize control of Pine Hollow's most valuable resources. Tom Bradley's small farm occupied land that contained a significant silver deposit, discovered during recent survey work, but not yet widely known. Edmund Harrison had attempted to manipulate Bradley into accepting a loan with impossible terms, then planned to foreclose when the inevitable default occurred. When Bradley had refused the initial loan offer, Harrison had commissioned Carson to eliminate the farmer's son as both revenge and warning. The death was intended to break Bradley's spirit and make him more amenable to future financial arrangements that would transfer ownership of his land to Harrison's shell companies. But The boy's unexpected recovery had disrupted Harrison's carefully laid plans, forcing him to consider more direct methods of acquiring the property he coveted. The final letter in Carson's collection, dated just 2 weeks earlier, instructed the poisoner to eliminate Tom Bradley himself if subtler approaches proved insufficient. Leather portfolio containing forged deeds and fraudulent loan documents revealed the full scope of Harrison's operation. He had been systematically targeting isolated mountain communities, using Carson's poisoning services to remove obstacles while acquiring valuable properties through legal mechanisms that appeared completely legitimate to outside authorities. The portfolio represented years of coordinated criminal activity disguised as routine business transactions, with Carson serving as the instrument of violence that made Harrison's fraudulent schemes possible. Each forged document bore official seals that had been stolen or counterfeited with remarkable skill, creating an illusion of legal authority that would fool most judges and local officials. "We could turn this evidence over to Marshal Fletcher," Rebecca suggested, though her tone suggested she found that option less than satisfying. Let federal authorities deal with both Carson and his employer. Ezekiel studied the forged documents by candlelight, noting the careful attention to detail that had gone into creating such convincing counterfeits. Legal justice assumes the system wants to punish men like Harrison. Rich bankers don't typically face serious consequences for crimes committed against mountain folk they consider beneath notice. The leather portfolio felt heavy in his hands, weighted with the knowledge that Carson's visit had brought far more danger to Pine Hollow than anyone had realized. The decision to eliminate Carson required careful planning that drew upon skills both Ezekiel and Rebecca had hoped to leave buried in their respective pasts. They could not risk allowing the professional poisoner to complete his mission against Tom Bradley, nor could they permit him to return to Charleston with intelligence about Pine Hollow's vulnerabilities that Edmund Harrison could exploit in future schemes. Carson's death needed to appear natural, both to avoid bringing unwanted attention to the settlement and to prevent Harrison from realizing his agent had been discovered and eliminated. Rebecca's medical knowledge provided the means, while Ezekiel's understanding of predatory psychology supplied the method for luring their target into a situation where justice could be administered without witnesses or evidence. In the firelight, ready to serve justice in ways that legal authorities had consistently failed to provide.